Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends, wherever you are calling in from around the globe. We've been waiting for you. This is a conversation that's been in the makings for quite some time. It's evolved, and I'll talk about that in a second. We've been waiting for you, so we're glad that you're here. I want to draw your attention right away to the comment section. For us in a webinar like this, the comment section is really a bit of a living document. It's a opportunity for us as participants to listen in well and to comment on the quotes that we hear that are compelling and link resources. You're going to see a number of resources that will accompany your ongoing learning and engagement in the comment section throughout the next hour. And so as things come up for you, please don't hesitate to pop those resources in the comment section as well. Also mind your space in the comment section. This is not a place to shame or attack or be defensive. It's a place to be generative and collaborative. And so that's how we want you to use that space. So go ahead and put your name and where you're calling in from so our panelists can see and say hello to you and to one another. The second feature I want to draw your attention to right off the bat is the Q&A feature. I imagine that there is a question that you brought into this conversation. I know that as this conversation unfolds, there's going to be a number of questions that are going to surface for you. And we want to encourage you to populate that Q&A feature. So don't hesitate. Don't worry about asking it correctly. Just practice asking the question, and then we're going to give a good portion of the second half of this conversation to what you're wondering about. My name is Jer Swigart. I'm the co-founder of the Global Immersion project and a member of the steering team for the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. The Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East is a network of evangelical leaders who are really working to build a more holistic perspective and sense of just engagement toward Israel, Palestine, and the entire Middle East. And so you'll be able to learn a little bit more about NEME in the link in the comment section right now. Global Immersion is a Jesus-centered peacemaking training organization here in North America that develops everyday peacemakers to join God and others in making all things new. We don't see peacemaking as an add-on to our faith, but the actual essence of it. It's not a hobby, it's a restorative way of life. And so everyday peacemakers from our point of view are women and men who are learning to see more accurately, immerse more courageously, and contend for justice more creatively. And I'll actually come back to those three practices at the very end, because there are going to be some next steps that you can take connected to seeing, immersing, and contending 60 minutes from now. For over a decade, my team has guided immersion experiences for North American faith leaders into the Middle East and into the conflict and the occupation there in those spaces, which means that our Israeli and Palestinian colleagues are remarkable at building our capacity for peace, justice, and reconciliation. But they're also remarkable in pointing out the parallels between the systems that oppress and cause injustice and violence in the Middle East with those that are happening on our own continent. It's amazing to experience our learning curve growing as it pertains to the conflict over there, but they always commission us to return to the places where we live, work, and play to be instruments of peace here in ways that echo restoratively to that space over there. And so the Israelis and Palestinians that we're working with are not just colleagues, they're friends, they're co-creators in the work of peace and justice. And obviously they're very much so on my mind and those of my colleagues who are on the call with us today. Let me just frame up this conversation very briefly, because it's going to be a dynamic one. As I mentioned, it's evolved in the last couple of days because the facts on the ground have evolved in Palestine and Israel, as well as a number of very relevant and important conversations have surfaced over the last week connected to the Lamenting Christian Nationalism Week of Action. There's a link that's going to show up in the comment thread. Well, you'll be able to access a whole number of really important resources as it pertains to Christian nationalism and the intersection of Christian nationalism with Christian Zionism. In the next hour, we're going to work to see through the haze of Western narratives. We're going to hear the perspective of the head of a Global Human Rights Watch organization that documents human rights offenses of the Palestinian people as a result of the militarized occupation of Israel in the Holy Land. After Jack's on-the-ground analysis, we've invited Mae Elise Cannon and Dominique Gilliard to offer commentary on the parallels between the systemic injustices that they've observed in the Holy Land with those that are prevalent on our own continent. You're going to hear terms like Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism, and we don't assume that there's a shared understanding. Libraries have literally been written on these terms, but you're going to hear the terms because we see these as twin powers that are undergirding much of the violence and the injustice both here and there. And so this isn't going to be a high-level theoretical conversation about the two terms. Rather, this webinar is going to focus on some of the gritty manifestations of Christian nationalism, Christian Zionism here and in the Holy Land. So let me just briefly define these terms, and then I'm going to get right into the introductions of our panelists. I'll define the terms and then I'll pop them into the comment section so that you can access them, because I know I'm a bit of a fast talker. So Christian nationalism in the United States is an ideology that is intrinsically tied to white supremacy and that promotes the myth that God has assigned superior status to the United States generally and to white US American Christian male dominion more specifically. There's a couple of resources that you're going to see appear in the comments section, including a webinar called What is Christian Nationalism that just happened this week. That is a remarkable conversation on the issue, as well as a book called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, where you can see there'll be a link for the book itself, as well as a review written by Tim Keller that I think is it frames the conversation pretty well. Christian Zionism, in summary, is a political movement supported by American Protestants generally and US American evangelicals specifically that asserts that God is exclusively on contemporary Israel's side, that God's blessings flow to Christians when we demonstrate our exclusive and unquestioning support of the nation state of Israel politically and economically. A couple of resources are going to emerge in the comments section. One, a webinar called Christian Zionism as Imperial Theology, featuring Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac, who's a Palestinian pastor, as well as a webinar that happened this week hosted by NEME called Two Chosen Peoples, Two Promised Lands, that really focuses on the intersection of Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism. Our hope by the end of this webinar is that we're going to understand some of the parallel manifestations of these twin powers, as well as the injustices and the systems and the structures that are parallel in the Holy Land and here in this space, so that we can become practitioners of peace and justice here and there. Our hope is that we're able to take some steps to dismantle Christian nationalism, Christian Zionism, and in so doing, work toward justice on our continent and in the Holy Land. So that's where we're going to go. I hope you're as ready and as excited as I am. I've got my notebook ready because our panelists are on point and ready to go. And so without any further ado, let me turn it over to you, Mae, for just some introductions. Who are you? Give us a little sense of your work and how it intersects with this conversation. Then we'll go to Jack Munire, and then Dominique, then we'll close with you, Jack.
Sure. So my name is Mae Cannon. I am ordained in an evangelical denomination, one of the few evangelical denominations that ordains women. My vocational life, I'm the executive director of an organization called Churches for Middle East Peace, which has 30 member communions and denominations across the theological spectrum: Orthodox, Catholic, mainline Protestant, evangelicals, peace churches. And it is a great privilege to do the work alongside of CMEP. For the purposes of this conversation, I feel like it's important to state and to acknowledge my evangelical identity, my theological foundation in terms of Christology and the saving power of the grace of Christ, the belief in the sacredness of the scriptures, the belief that the Holy Spirit moves and we can be sensitive to that, and a commitment to the whole mission of the church, which is critically important as you've laid out. And thank you for that incredible introduction, Jer. Christian Zionism and Christian nationalism, our theological starting point, is incredibly important as we talk about issues of justice, but also as we talk about the Middle East. So, I have, my background has been in local church ministry, writing about what does the Bible have to say about social justice, and actually seeking to reclaim the word justice, which it's appalling to me that the evangelical church struggles with it, but particularly the white evangelical church has had a contentious relationship with ideas of social justice, over the past decades and certainly the past century. And so what does it mean as a follower of Jesus to be committed to justice? That's what I've written about. Social Justice Handbook was my first book. My most recent book, Beyond #Activism, Comprehensive Justice in a Complicated Age. And then my doctoral work focuses on American Protestant engagement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So those are the lenses I'll bring into this conversation. I'm eager to talk about what the US government is doing and what they're not doing in response to these current escalations. And much looking forward to the conversation. So grateful to Jack joining us from Jerusalem, and to my dear friend Dominique, who has so much insight to bring to us about this conversation as well.
Thanks, Mae. My name is Dominique Gilliard. I serve as the Director of Racial Righteousness and Reconciliation for the Evangelical Covenant Church, which means that my job really is to serve as a pastor to pastors for our 890-odd churches throughout North America, helping them make connections between discipleship, biblical justice, and race. And what does it look like for us to bear witness to who and whose we are through how we intentionally gives us commission that says that the world will know that we are Christ's disciples by how we love one another. And so really commissioning people to understand the love of Christ in a way that leads to tangible ethical engagement in the world that bears witness to who and whose we are. In addition to that, I get a chance to serve as an adjunct professor at North Park Theological Seminary inside of a restorative arts program that we have inside of a maximum security prison in the suburb of Illinois, where we are the only institution in the state of Illinois that offers master's level education for incarcerated people. And in this program, we intentionally train up everyday peacemakers in conflict-ridden spaces. So we are making disciples, we're training up pastors to serve as pastoral presence in the midst of conflict. And we are intentionally forming men, and we just got a grant to go into a female prison to start working with women as well, who understand that no person is forever defined by the worst thing that they've ever done. And despite any mistakes they might have made in the past, God still has a missional purpose and desire for their lives. And so this work is really important as we talk about conflict. It's not about painting one side as, you know, all right, the other is all wrong. Like, how do we live in the tension and the messiness of the realities of our world and the brokenness, and what does the gospel has to say to us as ambassadors of reconciliation? And so I'll offer that and some direct parallels I've seen between the systemic injustice and the civil rights violations and civil and human rights violations on the ground, both in Israel, Palestine, and here in the US.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jack Monaya. I'm from Jerusalem, but in light of the changes that we're seeing here, I'm also defining myself as a Lidawi, or from Elid or Lod. And I am the local coordinator for the World Council of Churches program here in Israel and Palestine, called EAPPI, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Movement in Palestine and Israel, where we have internationals from all over the world that come here and accompany vulnerable Palestinian communities at the invitation of the heads of churches, of the Palestinian heads of churches. We try to provide protective presence for these vulnerable communities. We document and witness human rights violations and report them so that we are sharing the reality of what's happening on the ground. And then we advocate internationally and for each accompanier in their own home countries and what we see here. So these are sort of the three main pillars of what we try to do here in Israel and Palestine. I'm also involved in a number of advocacy initiatives as a Palestinian Christian. Christ at the Checkpoint is one of them, where Christian Zionism has been at the center of our conversations and a lot of what we deal with. So I think that this is a conversation that I'm very happy to be part of, and I think that this should be the first step of many in things that we can do about what's happening here on the ground.
Thanks so much, Jack. And just a word to you. I've had so many encounters with your team and established beautiful friendships with these peacemakers who are witnesses. And One of the pieces of work that I most admire is watching them accompany Palestinian children as they make their way through a militarized occupation to school. And it's just remarkable to watch you and your team go to work. So thank you so much for what you're doing over there. Jack, let's start with you. Obviously, there's so many mixed messages. We are all aware of a surge of violence. It's mixed in terms of why that's happening over here in the West because of the way that the media wants to portray the things. Talk to us about what you're seeing, what's happening, and how did we get here?
What we're seeing now is a game changer when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's something that either hasn't happened before or hasn't happened for a very, very long time. And it's been a long time coming in the sense that we are seeing Palestinians from Israel, from the West Bank, from Gaza, from East Jerusalem, that are all taking a step against what is happening here in this land. It sort of started from three main areas. The first is that for most Palestinians, and certainly in East Jerusalem, it feels like we're living in a pressurized cooker. We're constantly under pressure. We're constantly dealing with the discrimination and the realities of the occupation. And so there's only so long that can go on without a reaction. The second thing is that the police in Jerusalem had decided to take additional steps to limit the Muslim community from being able to celebrate their breaking a fast of Ramadan in the Old City around the Damascus Gate by limiting the public space where Palestinians can gather. The third thing is the attempt to kick out, dispossess, which other term, I've seen the word evict used a lot in the United States media, which I'm against. The attempt to kick out basically a number of Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and replace those families with Israeli Jewish settlers. So the combination of these three things has really stirred the Palestinian community here. And it sort of peaked when the Israeli security forces entered the Al-Aqsa compound, where the third holiest site of Islam, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, is there, and sort of provoked and clashed with the worshippers, going so far as to fire rubber bullets, tear gas, and stun bombs into the mosque itself. And so this caused a huge reaction, including from the Gaza Strip, where Hamas fired rockets into Israel, and Israel has responded by, until this very moment, bombing Gaza every day and every night, basically. And this is sort of the combination of events that have brought us to where we are right now. And that's a very brief covering of it. But the thing that is even more significant is to see the state violence, the police violence being used against protesters who are, for the vast majority, nonviolent. And it's been a real step on the gas for the Israeli police, to the point where sniper rifles have now been approved to be used in Israeli cities against Palestinian citizens, where we are also seeing right-wing extremists and settlers who are fighting and shooting at Palestinian civilians alongside the police. So you have the police who are firing sound bombs and tear gas at Palestinian protesters, and settlers shoulder to shoulder by them who are throwing stones, who are physically attacking Palestinians, and having the protection of the police. And so this is sort of almost a new chapter in what we're facing here as Palestinians. The difficulty is for us in Jerusalem is the crackdown on the nonviolent protests and the unbelievable excessive use of force, more than I have seen since, I suppose, I was a child, in fact. And there's a sense of hope and unity that is coming out of the situation because Palestinians have, for the most part, responded nonviolently. The second thing is there is sort of this new energy especially with young Palestinians, that's entering this picture, where we are seeing ourselves united in a way that we haven't been before. And this, I think, is a real threat to the system. It's a real threat to the Israeli police. And so the response has increased twofold. And there's also been a real solidarity with the people of Gaza. I'm not going to go through all the numbers and the news headlines, which I'm sure most of the listeners are familiar with, but the humanitarian disaster and the injustice that is going on right now in that strip has really sort of set alight the passion to do something as Palestinians. And so I'm incredibly proud to see the younger members of our community rise up against this. But at the same time, I'm very worried. This is because the level of activity of Israeli settlers and right-wing extremists and the green light they have been given to attack and suppress Palestinians. This is particularly a concern. In the city of my family, the city of Lod, Palestinians would not leave the homes because of lynch gangs that were going around the city looking for Palestinians to attack. They had set up a headquarters in the city and had started marking houses of Palestinians in the city for future attack. At the same time, they were also having rockets coming from Gaza, which forced them to be in their different defensive areas in bomb shelters, etc. And so this type of increased relationship between the extremists, and let's use the term also nationalists here, with the state authorities is something that should be a concern for everyone involved. It's almost like the rule of law has completely escaped the Palestinian citizens, completely escaped the residents of East Jerusalem, and fully in the hands of extremists right now. In the West Bank, where we normally see these types of protests and clashes take place, as of Friday, live ammunition has been authorized by the military to be used much more freely against nonviolent protesters. And we have seen over 20 deaths take place since Friday in the West Bank. And around 4 or 5 of those are as the results of settlers shooting and not the military. So we've almost seen the nationalists and the settlers, the religious extremists, whatever you want to call them, completely take over the security, let's say, responsibility that the occupying power has, and have taken it into their own hands. We're also seeing the trend of ammunition, whether rubber-coated bullets or live ammunition, specifically targeting the upper body of protesters, where in the past you would have it mixed with people, soldiers aiming at the legs or at the different limbs. Now we are seeing almost entirely in the upper body. So where are we going to go from here? Well, it's difficult to tell. It's difficult to tell because we're sort of still in the middle of this, and we don't know what the Israeli Authority is going to do in response to this type of united front that is being put by Palestinians. But this is very much the beginning of something that's going to follow us for a very long time. This is not something that is going to disappear and go away, and we're going to go back to whatever normal was beforehand. This is something that's transforming the Palestinian community as we are speaking. And so we really need to watch this space, because once the media headlines move on to something else, this struggle is still going to continue. And it's a struggle that's based around race and chosenness. It's not about safety and security and two sides having a dispute. It's about the role of one people and the subjugation of another, where one sees itself as the master and authority in the land, and the other one is seen as a second-class citizen that serves the framework of those in power. And so this is, I think, why the conversation and the language of Palestinians about the conflict is also transforming in a way that it hasn't been before. So we're facing a lot of challenges, but there's also some really hopeful signs here. So I think I'll stop here, and I'm sure we'll come back to discuss some of these things later.
Thanks so much, Jack. Really quickly, I appreciate your use of language. And as we all know, the way that we use words either furthers the divide or it works toward restoration. Mae, you did an excellent job, I think, answering the question around why you don't, Jack, appreciate the term eviction. I wonder if you would comment just briefly on why that word is distasteful to you, and then also help us understand lynching in your context.
The word eviction is not appropriate here because it indicates that the Israeli authorities or the Israeli Jewish settlers are the owners of the property where these Palestinians are living. Where in actual fact, these are Palestinian homes. These are Palestinians that have given up their rights as initially refugees in order to be in these homes. And these are US-funded settlers who have nothing to do with this area, who have nothing to do with these homes, who are attempting to change the demographic reality of East Jerusalem to push Palestinians out and to take over this space. So therefore, it's not a dispute between a landlord and a tenant. It's a dispute where one group of people want to displace another. So that's the reason I don't use the term eviction.
Thanks, Jack. And just comment briefly on the term lynching and how that's used over there.
Sorry, yes. Lynching here is you will have an organized group of, or a mob, if you like, people who are specifically looking for someone from another community, and specifically in this case, Israelis who are looking for Palestinians, to attack and bring harm, whether it's stabbing, whether it's beating, whether it's tying up and dragging around, which have been also seen in a number of cities. And so you will see in the Israeli news people who've infiltrated these groups and shared their plans publicly so that Palestinians know which cities they're targeting next. And so Palestinians can take shelter in their own homes. And the worst case scenario that we've seen in the city of Haifa is where they've been targeting Palestinian homes, trying to break in to grab people to lynch, essentially.
Thanks so much, Jack. And for those who are listening in, other questions that come to mind, I mean, this is an opportunity to really get the on the ground perspective. And so please use that Q&A feature to direct questions toward Jack so that he can be interacting with you while Mae and Dom offer some of their perspectives. Mae, let's turn our attention to you. Let's talk about some of the parallels between the systems and institutions of power that you see and have lived in over there, and that you're seeing at play here.
Yeah, so the title of this conversation is From Ferguson to Palestine, and I wanted to share why we decided to use that title. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar. Ferguson was in the US news many years ago with the death of Michael Brown, which was one of the most significant losses in terms of police brutality and raising awareness about police brutality in the United States, one of many. I mean, Trayvon Martin, his death was prior to that. And so all of that culminated a year ago, next week, with the death of George Floyd. And so as we're talking about racial conversations in the United States and the relationship between police forces and institutions of power and their relationship to people of color and to minority groups, that conversation domestically can be very much understood. Unique circumstances, certainly in terms of Israel and Palestine, but there are many, many parallels. And so we wanted to make a bit of a connection there. And the term From Ferguson to Palestine comes from a story I heard from one of my mentors, an African-American woman who is a leader in the evangelical world. She was in Ferguson during some of the follow-up conversations with church leaders. And she said a young Palestinian woman took her hand in the middle of these protests for racial justice in the United States and took her hand and held it up in the air and said, "From Ferguson to Palestine." And that image, is from a couple of years ago, and some of the similarities, and I know Dominique will talk about this as well, but it's really important for us to understand police forces in the United States, many of them are actually trained by Israeli experts and Israeli police forces. And so it's not even like this is just a metaphorical, what's happening in the United States looks like what's happening at these protests that Jack was talking about, in Jerusalem. It's that there's actually a physical connection, that there's actually similar mechanisms, let alone the fact that many of the tools that are used in the suppression of protests in the Palestinian territories were made in the United States. And so we tell the story often of being in Palestinian villages where you see tear gas canisters, and not just a few, I mean, dozens and dozens of tear gas canisters that have been used to quell protests, many of the protests nonviolent. I think that's really important for us to talk about. And when you pick up a tear gas canister, it says made in the United States. And so our work at Churches for Middle East Peace is about educating American Christians about holistic perspectives. We want to talk about historic Jewish ties to the land. We want to talk about the realities of anti-Semitism that are so severe and contribute to, many of these dynamics. And we want to talk about the reality of the occupation of the Palestinian people that's been going on since 1967, which, when we talk about this current escalation, people say, well, what started it? Or what was the, matchbox? Or what was the first event? And when you're hearing the vast majority of news in the United States, they start with rocket fire coming from Gaza into Israel. They don't start with what Jack was talking about, on the Temple Mount. They don't start with these evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. And those are not even the beginning. Let's go back to the decades of occupation. Let's go back to what happened, even pre-1967, the refugee population of Palestinians that was created in 1948, that today is more than 5 million Palestinian refugees, one of the largest refugee populations in the world. So what is the role of the United States in this? In addition to the police dynamics, in addition to the weaponization, and we'll talk a bit about some resolutions that just were presented on the House, and then Bernie Sanders presented one on the Senate side calling for the US to stop funding and to stop militarizing Israel when the very bombs that Israel buys from us are used on the people in Gaza, resulting in more than 60 children who have died in the last week alone. And so regardless of what your perspective is about who's at fault or the dynamics of power in the conflict, the disproportionate effect on children, particularly children in Gaza, cannot be ignored. So what is the role of the United States in all of this? And CMEP has been calling on the US government, particularly President Biden. We would invite you, please, please, please sign this action alert. We'll drop this action alert to the President and Vice President Harris in the chat. We're calling on the US government to demand a ceasefire. It is the least we can do in this moment. And just to give you a quick summary, and then we'll pass on and continue the conversation. President Biden's initial response to this, when you saw statements coming out of the White House, were almost unilaterally supportive of Israel. Israel can count on us to have your back. Israel has a right to defend itself. This is some of the language coming out of these statements from President Biden and from the White House. The language then shifted a bit, and the US said they were open to a ceasefire, which I think is utterly shameful that we would only be open to a ceasefire when a ceasefire is in the best interest of Israel and, of course, in the best interest, of Palestinians and especially of people in Gaza. So the U.S. was open to a ceasefire, and then the U.S. tone has shifted a bit in the last couple of days. The most recent conversation between President Biden and Netanyahu, President Biden communicated that he had expectations of de-escalation. And so the language has been, and we can put a quote specifically in the chat as well, the language has been gradually shifting towards slightly, maybe possibly putting pressure on Israel to move toward a ceasefire. And I like to think, and I fundamentally believe this is true, your advocacy makes a difference in that shift. The White House is hearing from thousands of people saying this is not enough. You have to call for an immediate ceasefire. So I'd encourage you to join us in that regard. And of course, there's more things that we can do, but that's a little snapshot of where things stand at this moment.
Mae, thanks so much. And for those of you who are listening and that are not familiar with Churches for Middle East Peace and Mae's work in particular, I urge you to get involved because in terms of political advocacy in the Christian space, no one is doing it like CMEP. And Mae, of all of the relationships that I have around the country in this regard, there's no one who gives themselves in the Christian space more tirelessly to fierce advocacy for justice and peace in Israel, Palestine than you. I know you're actually moving from this conversation into a meeting at the White House. And so thank you on behalf of all of us listening in to the very, very hard work that you're doing on behalf of Palestinians and Israelis, and also US American Christians, because we're losing our souls in this as well. So thank you very much. Dom, let's come to you. What are you hearing in this conversation so far? And I'd love to hear you begin to draw some parallels based on what you experienced and are observing between the Holy Land and here.
Yeah, so I want to start with a couple of quotes from Walter Brueggemann in his book, Chosen, Reading the Bible Amid the Israel-Palestinian Conflict. So a couple of things that he sets out at the beginning. He says that the state of Israel has evolved into an immense military power. The state of Israel has escalated and continues to escalate its occupation of the West Bank by an aggressive development of new settlements. And then the state of Israel has exhibited a massive indifference to the human rights of Palestinians. These three things lead him to conclude that in present inclinations and strategy, Israel cannot expect much positive play from its identity as God's chosen people. As a consequence, my own judgment, Brueggemann says, is that the important initiatives must be taken to secure the human rights of Palestinians. The state of Israel will continue to show little restraint in its action towards Palestinians as long as US policy gives it a blank check along with commensurate financial backing. And then lastly, he says, it will not do for Christian readers of the Bible to reduce the Bible to an ideological prop for the state of Israel, as though support of Israel were a final outcome of biblical testimony. It is my hope that the Christian community in the United States will cease to appeal to the Bible as a direct support for the state of Israel and will have the courage to deal with political realities without being cowed by accusations of anti-Semitism. It is further my hope that U.S. Christians will become more vigorous advocates for human rights and will urge the U.S. government to back away from a one-dimensional ideology for the sake of political realism. So I think those quotes for me are important framing for the conversation, stuff we've already had, but I think we haven't really explicitly pressed into the way in which there is this hermeneutic that many US evangelical, particularly white evangelicals, have aligned in a way in which their reading of the Bible tells them that the faithful response is this sole support of Israel at any cost, and regardless of what Israel does. And it's a very dangerous thing for us not to counteract that hermeneutic and actually not call it out. So when we talk about some of the parallels that exist, I had the privilege of going to Israel, Palestine with Global Immersion, and on the ground, here in the US, we talk about the Jim and Jane Crow South as if it is this, antiquated reality that used to exist in yesteryear, but has really kind of been eliminated from the world. But it really felt like stepping back into that reality, where Israeli and Palestinian folk have different license plates, where Palestinians can't go into certain territories, where there's different water tanks that are explicitly connected to resources, and an explicit marking of one from the other, so that discrimination can be clear and obvious and legally affirmed, is something that really jarred me. Another real parallel that I saw was just the intensity of police presence and military presence in Palestinian communities that were stigmatized, that were seen as, less than, in similar ways that you see in Black and Brown and Indigenous communities here in the US. The military presence of being armed and constantly having the threat of using arms as a way of coercing a certain type of behavior out of the least of these, the disenfranchised. The checkpoints and the dehumanization that people are subjected to, and the way in which there is a lack of accountability at the checkpoints in regards to being able to move freely over there reminded me of the historic realities of, Black, Asian people, Latinx folk having to carry documentation on them at all times at points in US history. And if they didn't, they could either be deported or incarcerated. This kind of institutionalization of sin that really leads to this reality of a sliding image of the Imago Dei, where the image of God and the humanity of people is certainly wholly firmed here and kind of on a sliding scale in this regard. One of the things that I'll never forget was during our time there, we were over in a Palestinian territory, and a young man came up to me and he pulled me to the side and he said, I just want to thank you and your people, because the resistance that we see Black folks doing in the US to the dehumanization and systemic sin that they've endured is a model for us. Like, we literally look to you all for strategies and kind of strategic approaches to how do we resist the evil that we're confronted with. And so I think the parallels are obvious. It goes over into everything from the history of redlining in this nation to the territories and how they've been set up, to the disparities in educational inequity and incarceration rates, and on and on and on, but also this history of displacement and the use of violence with displacement. But, part of the problem is that we don't really know even that history here by and large. So next month, we're going to celebrate, well, not celebrate. Next month, we're going to remember and lament the reality of the desecration of Black Wall Street. And it's going to be the 100-year anniversary. And last year fell on Pentecost weekend, and there were hardly no preachers who were able to make a connection between what was happening there and the spirit of Pentecost and newness that we were being called into. So just as a recap for folk, over the course of 2 days, enraged white citizens who envied the success of Black business leaders burned the flourishing community of the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma to the ground, decimating 35 city blocks with Black businesses, homes, and churches. 150 Black businesses, 1,265 Black homes were destroyed. 300 Black people were killed, 800 more were injured, and 9,000 were left homeless. The white mob caused at that point $1.8 million in damages, which would equate to roughly $25 million in damages today. And the fact that we don't know this history, we don't know this legacy of violent displacement, it helps us not make these connections to the violent displacement that Jack was lifting up earlier, and this whole history and legacy of institutionalized violence or vigilante violence that is sanctioned or at least permitted by systems that are supposed to hold vigilantes accountable and submit all people to the rule of law versus making certain exceptions. And, the whole rule of law, the last thing I'll just say with that is, we in the world are pretty much socialized to believe that law breeds order. But the question that the Christian must ask is, what happens and what are we called to when law breeds disorder? When law breeds injustice, when, and Dr. King famously said, don't forget, we can never forget that everything that Hitler did was legal. And so this assumption that law is something that brings stability, order, and justice is not true in many parts, in many places across the world. And we have to have integrity as Christians to speak up and name that when that's true, and advocate for a more just system that reflects the flourishing and shalom that God desires for all of God's children.
Thank you, Dom. Thank you so much. And I saw that in the comment section, there were a couple of links to Dom's 2 books, Rethinking Incarceration, which is a massive parallel between Israel, Palestine, and the United States, as well as Subversive Witness, which is due out soon, talking about privilege. And so I commend those to take a deeper discipleship dive in ways that will actually equip us to be about justice and peace. So thanks, Dom, for your contributions there. I want to move to some Q&A space, and I'm seeing some questions surface in the comment thread as well as in the Q&A. I want to start with a question that's in the Q&A. The question reads, I'd be interested to hear of the links between Christian nationalism in the United States and Jewish nationalism in Israel, especially in light of the nation state law. So just dive in, Mae, Jack, and Dom, as you will.
So perhaps I can jump in first. The nation state law is a bill that passed in the Israeli Knesset in 2018, which had covered a number of different issues, but perhaps most controversially, it said that the right of determination, self-determination in the state of Israel is solely for the Jewish people, that the land of Israel is for the Jewish people and it encourages Jewish settlement. This, by definition, made a legal hierarchy between Jewish citizens and non-Jewish citizens. And most non-Jewish citizens in Israel are Palestinians. So it is now legislated in law that certain rights are attributed to one group of people and not to another. So that's, sorry, just to give some context on what the nation state law is. The connection for me between Christian nationalism, Christian Zionism, and even I think Jewish nationalism was the question, was the issue of colonialism, and specifically white supremacy. This is a thread that connects all 3. Every single European colonial project is about chosenness and this sort of destiny that God has bestowed upon one group of people which are superior to others. So in our case, it's the Jewish Zionist movement coming from Europe, but in almost any other colonial project, you can see the same thing. And there's this perspective that they're here to advance the backwards and inferior people that live here, and therefore they have a right to conquer the land. Now, specifically within theological terms, it's about self-interest and blessing, right? I bless Israel so that I can be blessed. Palestinians are cursed because they are the descendants of Ishmael. And this is the same language that you see in white supremacy, Christian white supremacy in the United States, the curse of Ham, where the justification for slavery was based on a theological interpretation in the story of Noah. So in both of these situations, you see multiple different resources being used to justify not only decolonization, the dispossession of people, but the domination of people. And the interesting thing about this theological comparison between Ishmael and Ham is that there are also physical attributes that are given to people. Ham for his dark skin and Ishmael for being wild and hairy. And so we have to think about this when we think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in the US media, it's portrayed as one side against another, but this is not how it's taking place. You have a colonial power that is controlling and occupying a native population. And that's the way that we need to try and frame it when we have this discussion.
I would just jump in and take us back to where you started from with those definitions, Jer. And you mentioned this already, but I want to re-mention it as a resource. The event that happened a couple of days ago that the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, that NEME sponsored, is specifically on that question of the relationship between Christian Zionism and Christian nationalism. Lisa, Sharon Harper, others will put a link to it in the chat. And that's a part of a week that's happening this week, a week of action, lamenting Christian nationalism. So a group of evangelicals around the country got together after the January 6th insurrection and said, the very witness of Christ in the public square is at stake here in the United States. You might have seen during the insurrection in January, there were flags, carrying the name of Jesus. There were people carrying their Bibles. There's a video of a prayer that was prayed in the very chamber of the United States Senate that was language that many of us would be familiar with, calling on God as the omnipotent, omnipresent, marvelous creator, and then using the power of God to pray for the benefit of the United States over the world, which is Christian nationalism, which Christian Zionism relates to that because of those same streams of exceptionalism, what you were just talking about, Jack, in terms of the ideas of chosenness, the ideas of privilege. And I recommended a book in the chat. But I just think it's such a critical conversation. So I'd point people to that website for the Week of Action, Lamenting Christian Nationalism, where there's lots of events and conversations about how these two ideas relate.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to remember that scripture is very clear about the fact that Satan's sole purpose is to kill, steal, and destroy. And what we see Satan constantly do throughout scripture is take biblical truths and distort them slightly, or taint them to the point that they are no longer biblical truths, but they become idolatry. And what we're talking about are elements of biblical truth that have been distorted and become idolatrous that have actually led us to actually bear false witness. And when we as the church see this happening in our midst and we don't confront it, name it, denounce it, and call people to repentance, then we become complicit with it. And so what we're talking about is the way in which we are seeing a misappropriation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, politicized and mobilized in a way that is enacting anti-gospel realities in the world, and that is causing division that Christ never commissioned us to be about, as opposed to the reconciliation that we're commissioned by scripture to be engaged in as co-laborers with Christ in the renewing of all things to God's self. And so we're talking about how do we get back into right relationship with both God and neighbor and creation, and in the midst of doing it, how do we understand the call to peacemaking, which I know, Jer, you'll close with, and it's being so important. But peacemaking, one of the things we need to be really clear about, though, is there's a difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking, because a lot of what the church oftentimes calls for is peacekeeping, but the reality is when you keep what we proclaim as peace in the midst of an unjust status quo, then what we're actually doing is aligning ourselves with the patterns of this world and not the gospel of Jesus Christ and the renewing of our minds. But to actually be peacemakers means that we have to actually disrupt the false peace and actually proclaim a gospel vision of peace. And enacting that is going to disrupt the status quo, is going to disrupt what we have claimed as normative, because of the ways in which Satan has deceived us and led us into this alignment with nation states over and against the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so in both of what we're talking about the ways in which we have kind of been slowly but surely seduced away from the gospel into an alignment and allegiance with a nation state over and above against the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we're talking about what does it mean to recalibrate ourselves and recenter ourselves and solely commit ourselves to our true citizenship. So
that's spot on. And preaching, heart of flame. Thanks, Dom. That's spot on. And I think as well, like, in order to be peacemakers, we actually, especially my dominant culture sisters and brothers on the call, we have to learn what it means to absorb the violence of the state on behalf of those who have been marginalized by it. And so to be disruptors of the status quo means that we actually have to have the courage to move beyond the myth that to critique Israel is to be anti-Semitic. And so I just want to encourage us with that. Let me offer a couple of resources connected to see, immerse, and contend, 3 practices of everyday peacemaking. Then I'm going to come back to you 3 panelists for a final word. How would you encourage us to move beyond being pawns in a global game for power to peacemakers who are actively engaged in the work of justice? And so that's the question I want you to close with on the last word. Friends, a couple of resources that you're going to see emerge in the comment thread as well around see. How do we see more accurately? There's a documentary put out by Just Vision called My Neighborhood. It's a 20-minute documentary that gives you a very, very in-depth personal experience of the inhabitants of the neighborhood in East Jerusalem that is under attack right now. And so if you want to see more clearly what's going on, go ahead and watch that. I believe that you can watch that for free at Just Vision's website. In terms of immerse, that means intentionally displacing ourselves into the stories of another with relational and transformational intent, not to consume, but to pursue relationship for the sake of transformation. There are 2 immerse level conversations that are happening even in the next couple of days and weeks. One, the Telos group is hosting a webinar tomorrow called The Humans Behind the Headlines, and they're just going to feature a number of Israeli and Palestinians who are going to tell stories of what's happening from their points of view. And so immerse into those narratives in a way to continue to see through the haze of some of what's happening here in America, in Western media. And then the Global Immersion project is going to be featuring an Israeli peacemaker named Robbie Damelin, who's one of the leads of the Bereaved Families Network. These are Israeli and Palestinian families whose common ground, besides their humanity, is that they've lost someone that they loved to this conflict and militarized occupation. She's going to be a part of our Restoring Friendship webinar series on June the 10th, and you can register for that. You're going to see the link for that coming shortly. She's going to talk about the hard work of transcending physical and sociological boundaries and barriers to actually pursue real relationships with those who have been constructed as enemies for us. And so that's going to be a pretty riveting conversation. In terms of contend, you've seen it in the comment section a couple of times. There's a call to action. I don't think anybody's doing political advocacy calls to action, especially for US American Christians like Churches for Middle East Peace. And so you're going to see the link there for an action that you can take. It will take you 3 minutes to do. But as Mae said, when we're advocating with our representatives and saying this cannot go on, it actually changes things on Capitol Hill. And so the contend, getting creative in love today looks like a phone call, a phone message, or an email, and all of the instructions to do that are located here in this, the CMAP link. And so let me give you 3 the last word. How do we move from pawns in a global game of power to peacemakers who are engaged in the work of justice? Mae, let's start with you.
You know, we've been praying a lot. We say often pray for peace, and prayer is powerful, and we need to be prayerful prior to our actions, during our actions. And my prayer has often just been, especially this week, Lord, have mercy. That we can't forget. I'm so glad Telos is doing that conversation, but the faces, you know, of people, particularly in Gaza right now. We just did a webinar for Churches for Middle East Peace that you can find on our website. And Bassem, the head of Catholic Relief Services in Gaza, was talking about what it's like every moment. You know, we just got reports literally since we've been on this call that Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire as the fighting continues. And so I feel like that's a bit of the story. And we have a unique moment while the world is paying attention to this issue. As soon as there's a ceasefire and as soon as the rockets stop and the bombs stop, the world will stop paying attention and the occupation will continue. And the very issues that Jack has been talking about will continue. And so our invitation to you is just what you've shared, Jer. You know, sign up to be a part of this network of evangelicals. You know, sign up to be a part of CMEP's work. May we stay informed. May we be educated. May we be spiritually engaged, that this is about spiritual integrity. You know, and may we use our voices. So share about these things. Share this webinar on social media. You'd be willing to have hard conversations. I never knew what it meant to be someone's enemy until I started to work on this issue. And now I tell people all the time, don't Google me and don't believe what you read about me on Google. I've been called many, many, many a bad name. And yet may that be a privilege, that as we stand in this, you know, place for peace, may it be a privilege.
Thanks, Mae. Jack or Dom, I see you. Go ahead, buddy.
Yeah, I'll just say for me, I think I think about spiritual practices as something that can be helpful for us right here. And so I think about the spiritual practice of remembrance. So if we actually look at, if we take scripture seriously, and in the Old Testament, God calls Israel to remember who and whose it is over 100 times. And when Israel remembers who and whose it is, it lives faithfully and in right relationship with God. It reflects the love, mercy, and justice of God. But when Israel forgets, it's just as prone as anybody else to enact systems and structures that privilege some and disenfranchise others. And so I think remembrance was vital to Israel, is identity. And I believe that that's true for us as the people of God today. And so I think one of the reasons why we have such a hard time with conversations like this is because we don't remember. And so I think we need to remember, confess, lament, and repent. That's the cycle that I really encourage churches to engage in. Remember, confess, lament, and repent. And then I think in this particular conversation, I would just say we have to remember the power of proximity. And not everybody is going to be able to go to Israel, Palestine. We know that that's not tangible, but we can all be intentional about knowing that we have been implicitly and explicitly kind of formed in a way to think about this conflict. And we have to be intentional about exposing ourselves to voices on the ground and people who are actually immersed in it to dislodge some of that socialization so that we can actually hear from God anew and see the ways in which our brothers and sisters are suffering externally, and not just in our own neighborhood, but around the world.
So for me, there's two things I'd like to finish with, and they're connected. The first is that we're dealing here with systems and systems that adapt every time we try and resist. And so it requires a transnational approach. We, the Palestinians, cannot overthrow the system alone. We need each other because the problem, as we pointed out, with Christian Zionism, Christian nationalism are connected. And so that's the case for us here. So we need to think of ways in which we build these alliances rather than talk about, as Dom said, proximity as something that's just sort of far over there. Having said that, it's easy for us to point to the extremes, to Christian Zionists who are the John Hagees, to extreme Christian nationalists, but these are attitudes that exist within our allies, with our friends, with our supporters. And so the thing that I would say is that for those that want to support a just and peace solution for Israel and Palestine, for those that want to support the Palestinian cause, to examine these attitudes of Christian nationalism that exist within our own behavior and are also giving the space and allowing these extremists to basically to exist. These groups wouldn't exist without the complicit passivity, let's call it, of other members in the community. So let's try and avoid simply pointing at those that are on the periphery, but also examine within our own circles of where these attitudes exist.
Thanks, Jack. Friends, thank you for your contributions to this conversation. Mae, Dom, and Jack, absolutely phenomenal, insightful, transformative if we allow it to be. And so grateful to you. For those of you who are listening in, thank you for carving out some time to prioritize this conversation. You're going to be receiving a follow-up email from NEME that's going to include the recording of this webinar, as well as the recording of the webinar on Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism that happened earlier this week, as well as a number of the links that I think we set a record for links in the comment thread throughout this webinar. Thank you for that. You're gonna receive those in that follow-up email. We want to encourage you. We want to let you know as well that this has been Facebook Lived on, I saw it was on Churches for Middle East Peace, NEME Network, Mae's personal page, Global Immersion's page. And so you can access it there, use that, and use the recording as a tool within your sphere of influence. We have to grow some power, and that begins by just exposing people to conversations like these. So we want to encourage you to do that. Friends, don't just consume the inspiration and the education of this moment. Listen well and allow yourself to be changed by what you've heard. That's the stuff of everyday peacemaking. And so we bless you as you move from this space as instruments of peace throughout the rest of your day. And we look forward to the next NEME webinar, which you'll hear from soon. So thanks, friends. Bye for now.